A work session this morning on our water shortage response plan. This is something staff has probably been working on for at least the last year with respect to updating our plan as it relates to various different issues that we could be faced with in the future. We also have one other item after the work session this morning as it relates to some correspondence. And I will talk to you a little bit about that later. But with that being said, I will turn it over to Ed Koschicki to lead the work session.
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate it. Good morning, Commissioners. Mr. Chairman. The agenda for this morning is to talk about our water shortage response plan. Do it that way. Our agenda is to talk about what the objectives of this program are, what we're trying to do with this new water shortage response plan and the associated ordinance update that will go with it. Give you a little history and background. Talk about briefly about our existing water conservation ordinance that this will be replacing. Talk to you about demand management strategies, water conservation as distinct from just water shortage response, what do we do in terms of drought or emergencies. And then talk to you about that proposed framework for the plan and then the next steps that we need to take to move forward with the implementation. So the objectives of this program are to first and foremost establish a long-term demand management strategy, water conservation strategy, that's distinct from our response to water shortages. So we have a water conservation ordinance right now that incorporates elements of both. And in the new ordinance, we're trying to clearly differentiate between what do we do long-term, every day in terms of water conservation as compared to what are the kinds of things we do in response to water shortages. We also need to create a plan that gives us tools to effectively respond to those water shortage conditions and conditions that result from drought, from capacity limitations, and in the event of system emergencies. And the third element is to make sure that our plan complies with state regulations and with the Low Inflow Protocol, which is the prescriptive procedures that we have bought into as part of our being a signatory to the Duke relicensing agreement on the Catawba River. So we along with about 50 other entities, are signatories to that relicensing agreement. That relicensing agreement in it has low flow protocols that when certain conditions exist within the river, we're going to implement certain water restrictions along with the rest of the region. Our current ordinance is close to it, but not quite. We need to get that in sync. We'll talk obviously a lot more about that as we go through. Just brief history of our original water conservation ordinance was put in place back in 1992, and it was really in response to capacity limitations that we had. This is just before the new Catawba water treatment plant came online, and the history that I hear is that literally we didn't have enough capacity to keep our water tanks filled, so we couldn't get the water out of the plant fast enough to get them into our tanks, and it was literally that critical of a situation before that plant came on board. Those of you that were here, which is all of you, I think, 2002 was a severe drought in this area, and the ordinance was amended then. We had even a worse drought in 2007, and that is our drought of record, which means it is the worst drought on record in this region, and it was further amended then. 2008, the state passed legislation in response to the 2007 drought, mandating that all utilities have a drought response plan. So prior to that, we were doing this as good practice. After 2008, there are now state regulations that say you have to have a plan, and there are regulations that say what that plan needs to include. 2008 is also when we entered into the Low Flow Protocol with the Catawba Water Management Group as part of the Duke relicensing. 2009, we did an amendment that added the 2-day continuing process with 2-day restrictions, and also amended the appeals and variance aspect. So our existing ordinance, again, has been in place for over a 20-year period. The existing ordinance really doesn't address long-term demand management strategies, water conservation strategies, even though it's called a water conservation ordinance. It spent very little time on water conservation issues. Most of it is really drought response. And the existing ordinance, because it's been amended so many times, it is not easy to follow. It is not really clear in a lot of its language in terms of whether it's a permissive action that we could take, whether it's a mandatory action. Does the manager have the authority? Does the board need to be consulted? So part of this exercise is really to clean up that language and clarify the roles and responsibilities. First element we're going to talk about is the demand management strategies, the water conservation elements of this plan. First question is, why do we need demand management strategies? Why do we need ongoing water conservation measures? The biggest challenge we have in the water industry is our water treatment plants and our major distribution system for water has to be designed to meet that peak day demand. When everyone turns on their faucets, when everyone's using water, people expect water to come out of the faucet. That's the expectation of our customers. So our treatment facilities need to be designed and sized and built to meet that peak day demand. The peak hourly demand during that day we meet through our elevated storage tanks that we have throughout the system. But to meet that peak day demand, we need to have the plant capacity there and the pipe capacity, the pumps there to get the water to our customers. Same as Duke has to do on power. You know, when everyone turns their air conditioning on in the summer and the power demand goes up, they need to have the ability to meet that peak demand. Our water plants are infrastructure all sized to do that. Reducing peak demand was the basis for sizing our future treatment plants. Our history back in 2007, 2008, we had extremely high peak demands compared to our average demand. So during the droughts of 2007, following up even in 2008, we were seeing really high peak demands. Our peak day was more than 2 times our average day, which is much more than the industry average. So we were seeing very inordinate peak days compared to average days. And we said, we can't afford that going forward. We can't afford to build an infrastructure for the next 20, 30 years to provide 2 times the peak day for those 4 days a year that we have that kind of demand. And it's literally was that kind of 4, 5, 6 days in a year you would get those kinds of peaks. So we said we need to put strategies and processes in place that mitigate those peaks, that keep those peaks from happening. And we do that a couple of different ways. Also, our other problem with this, if we don't manage it ourselves, and if we don't put processes in place to reduce that peak, as we're going forward now with our new water supply off the Yadkin River, we're going through an interbasin transfer permit process right now. As part of that process, the first questions we're being asked right now, what are you doing to minimize that requirement? Show me your efficiency of utilization, show me how you've reduced your demand, show me how you've done these kinds of things, because the state's going, I'm not going to let you take that much water for those peak days. You've got to manage this effectively and efficiently. So we've done things on our own as good stewards of the resource, and if we don't, the state will be there to tell us to be good stewards, but we've been proactive in this. The way we do demand management in this industry is really 3 ways that we do this. We have what's termed an inclining block rate structure for our water bills. So the more you use, the more you pay. As you go up your first 3,000 gallons of water is billed at one rate, 3,000 to 6,000 gallons is billed at a higher rate, 6,000 to 10,000 gallons, or thereabout, don't quote me on the exact numbers, is billed at a higher rate. Over 10,000, we bill you at a very high rate. So it's called an inclining block. The more you use, the higher the rate becomes. And the intent there is to discourage that high-end use of water, and if you want to use that water, that you pay proportionately for that capacity we're building for you. So we have a very aggressive inclining block rate compared to the state. Only a few other utilities have as an aggressive of a plan where it ramps up that high. The other thing we've done in Union County is put in irrigation restrictions. So by telling people you can only irrigate so many days per week, that further reduces that peak. And we have, since 2009, we have been in a 2-day per week watering restriction. And we spread those 2 days per week over through 10 different zones and spread that over 6 days of the week. So on any given day, we only have 20% of our customers actually watering. So it spreads that peak over that period. And we also, we do some limited public education, and it's one of the things we recognize we need to be doing more of, is teaching our customers how to use that water better. Elements of the plan will address conservation essentially by setting a new norm for irrigation. This is probably the biggest change we're proposing as part of this plan. Our existing ordinance doesn't have a standard for saying, okay, in non-drought situations, you could, right now under our ordinance, in a non-drought, you can irrigate as much as you want. This board put restrictions in place in 2009 and created a modified stage 2 restriction that said, during this non-drought situation, because we have capacity concerns and we have peak day concerns, we have limited our customers to only 2 days per week. But we kept the rates at our normal rate. One of the other things I wanted to point out, and now is as good a time as any, in our current ordinance, as we go through different stages of drought, we go from no drought situation to a stage 1 to a stage 2 drought as the drought gets more severe. We impose these watering restrictions and other water use restrictions. We also bump our water rates up. So the rate ordinance that we have in place that this board approved just in support of the budget, as our previous rates have since 2009, if we go from a stage 1 drought to a stage 2 drought, that whole block rate jumps up. And we're telling people, okay, not only do we want you using less, but you're going to be paying more. So it's a double incentive to reduce that consumption. What the board did in 2009 as part of our standard said, okay, we're going to do stage 2 water conservation, only irrigate 2 days per week, but we're going to keep the rates at the normal rate. We said, because we need this as a long-term strategy, but we don't need to penalize our customers for a higher rate just because we need demand management strategies. So we've been using part of the rate structure, part of the water conservation ordinance, and what we're doing in this rewrite is saying we need a new norm. We need a new normal, and we need to establish what that new normal is. And what we're proposing to the board is that the new normal condition for Union County water customers would be you cannot irrigate more than 3 days per week. That we would move it up from 2 days per week that it is now, loosen that up to 3 days per week, but still keep a restriction and not go back to a situation that says you can water whenever you want. The reason for doing that is these water restrictions really work in reducing peak demand. It's the most effective tool we have in keeping that peak demand down, because even with rates, rates will penalize those that are not willing to pay the dollars. Some are willing to pay the dollars, and still we've seen that we had high peaks. This is an historical graph of our flows in 2006, 7, 8, 9. And you can see back in 2006, we were approaching the drought, and we had no watering restrictions in there at all. And you can see our peak days, and this is 8 years ago now almost, our peak days were approaching 20 million gallons per day. So we had very high peaks for the system 8 years ago. In 2007, as we got into the drought, we started hitting peaks beyond our capacity. So we were borrowing capacity from our partner in Catawba water treatment plant in order to meet these peak day demands, and we're actually exceeding those demands. And you can see the county then started implementing different watering restriction strategies during 2007 and 8, and literally was experimenting with what works better, 2 days per week on certain days, 1 day per week, only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, went back to none, went back to 1 day per week on Saturdays and Sundays, which is probably the worst plan we ever put in place, because you can see we just had these huge peaks every other weekend. It just peaked terribly because everyone was irrigating on those 2 days. Went back to 1 day per week as we got into the winter months, and then as we went into 2009, institutionalized 2 days per week, Monday through Friday. And this was done not because of drought, but was done because we still had capacity issues. We still had peak days. Our total capacity in the system at that time was 20 million gallons per day. We had 18 million gallons from Catawba. We had 2 million capacity only for Manson at that time. Physical, even though we have a contract for 4, we physically could only bring in 2 at that time. So the board instituted this 2-day per week to make sure we stayed within our 20 million gallons per day. It was very effective. As we moved into 2010, which was a dry year, we still kept that peak under 20 million gallons per day. In 2011, we put in another 1 million gallons day of capacity for Manson with improvements we made, 1 million to 1.5 million gallons per day more that we can get from Manson County. And in 2012, we entered into an agreement with our partner, Lancaster Water and Sewer District, to lease an additional 3 MGD of capacity from them to bump our total capacity up to 24 million gallons per day. So you can see we've controlled that peak where before we were over 20. Our peak days are now running in the 15s, 16s, and have actually come down over time. We had some higher peaks this year in June, but we managed to keep that peak down. And you can see we are significantly below our capacity now. Where in previous years, we were exceeding our capacity. We managed to bring the peak down, bring the capacity up, and create an appropriate buffer there to deal with growth in the system. So the point here is these restrictions work. They're effective. They keep us in a managed framework. And this is what the green line is the ratio of our peak day that year to the average day for that year. 2006 was around 1.75. We went over 2 in 2007, and now we brought this down to about 1.5. Our master plan assumed that we would, on average, keep that ratio no more than 1.9. In our IBT permit that we submitted to the state, we've ratcheted that down to 1.7. And again, we're running at around 1.5 right now, but these have been some wet years. We think in a dry year we will be back at that 1.7. So the message to the board is we need to be at this 1.7 level. That's where we need to manage our peak days. So we need some controls. We've seen when we look back at the data, with no controls on irrigation demand, we will have peaks that will go back up to 1.9. So our recommendation is we can loosen this up. We have that capacity. We don't need to be as stringent as we are right now. We can loosen the program up, and our recommendation is that we go to the 3 days per week. We have met with the green industry. We've met with the Cooperative Extension Agency. We've met with representatives that they've introduced us to in the irrigation and nursery business, and wanted to verify with them, okay, how much irrigation do our customers need? What do we really, if you look at some of the science and you get really different kind of numbers. So we said, let's go to the experts that do this every day. And what we heard from them universally was, in this part of the country, 1 inch per week for tall fescue lawn is an adequate amount to maintain your lawn, even during the summer months. It may not be as beautiful and green as it is in the fall and the spring, but it will keep it alive, it'll be maintained, and you'll have a successful lawn. We looked at that, and we ran the numbers then and said, okay, if we're going to do 1 inch per week, and here's how much an irrigation head puts out, and here's how many days per week you can irrigate, and here's the times, and said, yeah, this is not a problem. 3 days per week, you can more than adequately irrigate your lawn. You could do 2 or 3 times that amount in a 3 day per week irrigation. So 3 days per week gives our customers the ability to manage their property, manage their lawns, keep them green, keep them viable, and can do that over that 3 days. One of the things we recognized, and one of the things that was reinforced by the Agricultural Extension Group, is we really need to do a lot more outreach to our customers on how to maintain their property and what's the appropriate way to water your lawn and maintain your lawn. There's a lot of wasted water going on where people are, fertilizing their lawn, burning it out, and then irrigating the heck out of it, trying to get it to come back, or watering it in the middle of the day instead of in the cooler hours. So there's a lot of education that we said we need to work with Cooperative Extension and start getting that information out to our customers. There are other jurisdictions that do year-round water conservation as a demand management strategy, that do this year-round restrictions. And there are 6 other entities in the state that are doing this now, and they're all doing 3 days per week. So it's Apex, Cary, City of Durham, Fayetteville, and Orange Water and Sewer Authority in the Chapel Hill area. Concord and Kannapolis also do this and were required to do this as part of their settlement agreement to get their IBT. So they were sued on their IBT, went through litigation as part of that settlement. On the litigation, entered into a settlement agreement and implemented some very stringent water conservation measures, including 3 days per week. So the position I think this puts us in our recommendation, at 3 days per week, we are doing as much as anyone in the state. So right now, we are doing more than anyone in the state. And we were doing it voluntarily in response to capacity. We resolved a lot of our capacity issues in the short term. We think it's prudent to keep some level of restriction in place. 3 days per week is as much as anyone else is doing. I think it would be unrealistic to think the state, as part of our IBT certificate, would come back and say we need to do more than they've required other folks to do. It's proactive on our part, and it's a loosening of where we are now. So we're opening this up for our customers, saying we're going to make this less stringent than it is today, but we're still going to keep some level of control in place. So that's our first and our biggest recommendation to the board. And unless I hear direction from the board right now that says that's a bad idea, that's what we'll be putting into the draft ordinance that will be coming back to you in a month or two. So before I move on to the next issue, I'd like to stop and just see if there's any comments, concerns, questions from the board on this issue.
I just have a curiosity question. I noticed 18-wheel water tankers pulling up to our hydrants. What rate do these people pay? Because, I mean, I watched a neighbor put in a pool and they brought 3 18-wheelers in. So, I mean, they'll exceed your capacities in one day.
Shelley, can you tell us? Shelley is business manager and director of business operation for Public Works.
They pay a flat commercial rate as if they were a commercial customer as they pull from it. Those trucks are metered. There's meters on those that are supposed to be, if they're doing it legally by permit. And they report those to us on a monthly basis, and then we confirm those readings once a year.
Can you track hydrants?
We have specific hydrants identified in the system that we tell the contractors who are licensed with us. So if you want to fill up from a hydrant, you come to us, you get a permit, and that permit gets slapped on your truck that says, okay, you're licensed and authorized to pull from this hydrant. And we tell them which hydrants they could use, and they have a meter on their truck. Well, that's the way it's supposed to work. Part of our challenge is we're very close to Mecklenburg County, and we get contractors from Mecklenburg County coming over, and it's a dust control contractor for new construction. And so they bring their water truck in and they fill up at a hydrant. And they go, well, I got a permit, and I look at the permit, and our staff looks at the permit, it's a Mecklenburg County permit, and go, you're not permitted here. So it's one of those continuing enforcement issues that we try to deal with. It's not a large volume of water, but we do track that and monitor that to the extent we can.
Just curious.
I do have one question. Given that over the last however many years we've been on this 2-day restriction, in preparation for our expanding our water system, we've seen the need to adjust some of our rates.
Mm-hmm.
By going to this 3-day, will that allow for, obviously it's going to allow for increased revenue. Will that increased revenue allow us perhaps to offset some of the future rate increases that we were predicting?
It could, but honestly, we've looked at this and we don't think we're going to see a significant change coming from 2 to 3 days per week. Our customers have been doing 2 days per week now since 2009, over 5 years that they've been, almost 5 years that they've been in this process. We're going to implement this in the winter months, is when this ordinance will go in place when people aren't irrigating. I think it's going to be more of a response to the weather than to anything else that we see next year as to whether or not we see our revenue go up. But I don't think changing from 2 to 3 days per week will have a significant change, because on the other side of this, we have our declining block rate that's also saying, okay, you can use more, but oh, by the way, you're still going to pay for it. So there is that potential. It's something, obviously, it's something we track monthly and see where our revenue is going, but we're not anticipating that this is going to be a big new revenue generator for us.
Along that line, Yeah, I know we talked the other day about this, that there seems to be a potential for more revenue, even if we got I would hope we would have more users that would use the higher tier water because they're paying exponentially more than the base users. But since we've incurred so much expense to expand the infrastructure and water capacity, does it not make more sense to get the usage closer to that capacity to offset that expense? Or, I mean, short absence of an IBT application in state regulation.
The challenge in the water industry, and particularly in this state, it's a 10-year process to get new capacity on board, and we're seeing that. We're going through that with the Yakin Regional, Yakin Water Supply Project that we initiated a year and a half ago now. So you need to have enough inventory of capacity to really carry you through to that next increment. So on paper, it looks like we've got a little extra. We get real concerned as we look out though, 7-8 years that it's going to take us to finish this water supply project. Can we stay within that? So it used to be, when I started in this career, it was a 5-year cycle. It's how long does it take? Permitting was a year, and then you did design and construction, and 5 years start to finish, you were done, plant online. The permitting has become such a major issue, particularly in North Carolina. You have a 5-year permitting cycle to go through. So that's our challenge. So with that, I'll take that as consensus from the board to move forward with this 3-day per week in the ordinance. Again, this will come back to you as a draft ordinance. There'll be a public hearing we'll need to do as part of that. But we'll move forward drafting it on this premise. Water shortage response plan. The other aspect of this plan is how do we respond to drought? And a lot of this, again, this aspect isn't so much new. It's restructuring, cleaning it up, and giving us clearer lines of authority in terms of what we can do and can't do. We are required to comply with both state regulations now. Since 2008, there's been state law on water shortage response plans. And again, we have the Low Inflow Protocol, which is the protocols established by the Catawba Watery Water Management Group, which we are a member of as signatories to the Duke relicensing agreement. So Duke went through this whole process to pull all their stakeholders together as part of that relicensing, got everyone to the table, I heard yesterday they spent $20–30 million on the process of relicensing. I mean, there were over 50 plus signatures to this agreement. It was a huge outreach program. But all the water utilities off the Catawba that are signatories to this, which were all the water utilities, agreed to these protocols that said when we're in this stage of drought, we're going to do these kinds of things. The primary focus is response to drought. The Low Inflow Protocol defines 5 different levels of drought within the Catawba Basin, depending on the severity of climate, water levels. We'll talk about that. Duke Energy is the one that manages the process. So it's Duke's hydrologist and Duke's meteorologist that review the data coming in and declare that, okay, we are now in a stage 1 or a stage 2, and send that information out through a drought management advisory committee, of which we are a member also. The Low Inflow Protocol prescribes how stakeholders will implement water use restrictions. So it's a very prescriptive. We're in stage 1, you do this. We're in stage 2, you do this. Each stage gets progressively more stringent and less water that you can use. And our challenge right now, our existing ordinance has some discrepancies with the Low Inflow Protocol. It's not lined up exactly. Again, our ordinance was in place way before the Low Inflow Protocol came into being. It's been amended, but it's still not lined up exactly. This plan also addresses conditions beyond drought. And we recognize that we need to specifically address not only what do we do if drought becomes a problem, we need to address what do we do if we start bumping up that capacity issue again. If all of a sudden, it takes us longer to get our plants built and we're growing and we start coming up near our capacity limitations, how do we respond to that? Rather than doing it ad hoc as we've done in the past. And what do we do in a system emergency? Our water treatment plant, 80% of our water right now comes from the Catawba River. We pull off the river for the Catawba plant. There's railroad crossings upstream, there's highway crossings upstream, and there's a potential for an oil truck to go off the bridge and into the river. What do you do? And so there's a potential, we could have a major pipe failure coming from the plant into the county. We don't have in our current ordinance prescriptive measures that really say what kind of response could be put in place in terms of water restrictions in the system emergency. It's very loosely written. We'll talk more about that. So the protocols describe which stage will need to be declared and its corresponding response. And the way we structured this program, we tried to keep this as systematic as possible because we're engineers and that's what we do. Essentially, there's three types of shortages that we need to deal with: resource limitations, drought, capacity limitations, or system emergencies. Each one of those has a set of protocols. So on the drought situation, we have the Catawba Watery Low Inflow Protocol. The state could also come in. The state created in the 2008 legislation a Drought Management Advisory Council that they can empower during a drought, and that council has the authority to actually override existing protocols and say, no, you're actually in a worse situation than the area in general and you need to do more. So that authority exists. They've never utilized it, but it does exist. Capacity limitations, we'll show you, we've come up with some prescribed protocols that say, if we're here, if our demand reaches this level, we're going to kick into a certain level of conservation, where we really don't have that right. We don't have that at all right now, really. It's very loosely worded the way it works right now. System emergencies, we have almost nothing in there right now in our current ordinance that says what we can do. So we created language that in this draft ordinance that addresses what happens if we have a source water contamination, plant disruption, or other emergencies. The way the process works, we have really just one set of responses. So we've described in the ordinance stage 0, our normal condition, what we do, and then stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there's one set of responses that apply to all these conditions. So we don't have a different condition that if it's a system emergency, we're going to do something different than this. We're going to do, so we try to keep it as simple as we could. Said, here's the 4 stages that we can go into of response from normal up through 4. And how we get there is dependent on the condition. So as an example, if there was an oil spill in the Catawba, that would be a system emergency. It would be a source water contamination emergency. And depending on the severity, we would make a determination, do we need to be in stage 2 or stage 3? What level of restriction do we need to be in? We'll talk more about that. Authority in an emergency will actually rest with the manager to make that determination based upon Public Works Director's recommendation. But we're using these same parameters. We're not creating a separate parameter for a system emergency than we would for drought. So the responses become the same. Drought response, again, the biggest part of this and how we deal with drought. The Low Inflow Protocol that's established is, again, a very prescriptive process. And the protocol looks at 3 measures. So Duke's hydrologists, meteorologists are looking at 3 different parameters. They're looking at storage index, which is really lake levels. So they're looking at the lake levels in the Catawba River and going, where are they with respect to normal? And they go through, it's between 90 and 100%, 70 and 90. They're looking at where that lake levels are, and they're looking at all of them in combination and come up with a mathematical formula for that. There is also the stream gauge information where they're looking at what's the level of flows in the streams feeding into the Catawba, and are they drying out, are they still flowing well? A lot of this is a function of groundwater and what has been the condition previously. And the third parameter they look at is the U.S. Drought Monitor. The U.S. Drought Monitor is a U.S. Geographical Survey model that the federal government does, where they're looking at overall drought conditions. And this is really looking at weather. So the drought index here is a weather-related issue. How dry is it? Is rain forecast? It's that kind of issue. So you're looking at weather, you're looking at storage in the reservoirs, and you're looking at how much stream flow do you have. And they put it into a prescriptive formula and go, okay, if this is this and you have either one of these, then you're in a stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3. I point you to the left column. Stage 0, we're always going to watch. We're always looking to see if we're in trouble or not. Stage 1 is moderate. Going, okay, we're in a slight drought condition. We need to be aware. Stage 2 is getting into a severe drought. And it's like, okay, we now have problems, and we'll talk about, we're now getting into mandatory restrictions. Stage 3 and Stage 4 are extreme and exceptional. And these are terms that come right out of the Drought Monitor Index. So if you're in a Stage 3, you're already in pretty extreme condition. We wound up in Stage 3 in the 2007 drought. So the worst drought on record in the Carolina area here put us into a Stage 3 drought condition under these parameters. It was a Stage 4 drought from just weather. So from the USGS weather perspective, we were in a Stage 4, but because lake levels and stream levels, we stayed in a Stage 3. And that was, obviously, this was the worst drought on record in the history of record keeping, going back 80, 90 years of record that we have in North Carolina. So it puts that in perspective. That's what the Catawba River looked like in certain areas during that Stage 3 drought. So you can see this was a pretty extreme situation. California is in a Stage 4 drought right now from the USGS drought index. You can see the whole state is in the worst possible condition they could be in. And it's, I point this out because when the next slide we're going to be looking at are what are the restrictions we put in place. And I want you to have the perception that when we're looking at Stage 3 restrictions and Stage 4 restrictions, we're talking about pretty severe conditions that we're dealing with. This isn't, gee, it hasn't rained in the last month. This is, we're in a really severe drought condition. So what are those restrictions? This compares our existing ordinance with what the Low Inflow Protocol prescribes and what we are now recommending as part of the new ordinance. On the normal conditions, our existing ordinance is silent, doesn't say anything. The Low Inflow Protocol specifically says there's no restrictions. And again, as part of our demand management strategy, we're saying in normal conditions, we're going to have mandatory 3-day restriction on irrigation. So it's bolded because that's changed. Stage 1, voluntary. Low Inflow Protocol, voluntary, 2 days or less, still voluntary. So when we're at Stage 1, okay, it's a moderate drought, things aren't terrible. We do more public information and education at that point than anything else. We're advising our customers, we're in a drought, please conserve, here are the kinds of things you can do, you should limit your irrigation. If it gets worse and we move into a Stage 2 drought, we're now into a moderate, severe drought?
Yeah. Yes.
Or you've got words.
Stage 2
Severe drought. The existing ordinance says mandatory 2-day irrigation. Same with the protocol, same as we're recommending a new one. So now, okay, we've been at 3, you've got to reduce to 2 days per week, no more than that. If the drought continues and we jump into a Stage 3, this is one of the changes. Our existing ordinance says mandatory 2 days or less and really doesn't prescribe who has the authority to make it less than 2 days. So it was kind of confusing whether or not, if we wanted to make it 1 day, would we have to come back to the board. Low Inflow Protocol is very specific, says you will have 1 day or less, and we're recommending that at Stage 3, we're going to be 1 day or less, and the less could be at the county manager's authorization. So the county manager could say, yeah, this is really bad, we're having issues, we need to go here. At Stage 4, across the board, existing and new, there is no more irrigation. At Stage 4, you're literally rationing water. We're saying we're running out, we're in California condition where 30 days, some utilities in California are literally looking at a situation where 30 days are out of water. And they're looking to neighbors and neighboring communities on how are they going to get water. So that's how bad Stage 4 is. Stage 4 is we're running out, we're worried about whether or not we have water for customers for bathing and drinking and cooking and showering. We're not doing irrigation. Your lawn's going to die and crisp up and worry about it next year. So it is progressive. They build on each other. I'm one of those people. I have to. But that's how severe Stage 4 gets. The other issue we're dealing with is capacity limitations. Again, where we start approaching our daily demand, those peak days start approaching our capacity in the plant. The existing ordinance uses language of if the sustained demand is 80% of our capacity, we're going to go to Stage 1. If the sustained demand is 90% of capacity, we're going to go to Stage 2. I don't know what sustained demand means. Is that 3 days, a week, a month? It's a very ambiguous term. So we said we need to tighten up this language to make it more enforceable. We can't enforce a sustained demand kind of language. So we did a lot of engineering on this and a lot of analysis of historical data to look at what's a realistic framework to put in place for this or not. And we went back and took this data and compared it back to the 07 drought and said, what does this criteria do applied to the 07 drought? So the criteria we're suggesting is that if our demand for a 7-day period, so our average 7-day period, exceeds 80% of the plant capacity, we would go into stage 1. Stage 1 is still voluntary restrictions. So we're not doing anything other than public information, education, saying people you need to conserve, things getting tight. If that 7-day demand exceeds 90% of our capacity, we drop down to 2 days per week irrigation. If we exceed the plant capacity for 7 days, we go into mandatory 1 day per week. We looked at this and went back to the 2007, and we never got more than stage 2. So even in the worst drought of record, we never went more than stage 2. And there are no state regulations in this regard. The state does not control restrictions on capacity. If you're out of capacity, you're out of capacity. That is your problem as a system deliverer. On wastewater, they get much more concerned. If you see your wastewater treatment plant capacity, you're now polluting rivers of the state. So they're very concerned on the wastewater side about not exceeding capacity. We have the physical ability to exceed our capacity because we're partners with another utility on the Catawba plant, and there's excess capacity. Normally, you can't exceed your capacity. Your plant capacity is 20. You've got 20, and you're not going to exceed it because you physically can't. So we think the restrictions are appropriate to put the notice out there that says we need to cut back. We should never get to this situation again. We have a unique history in Union County of having been in this position twice in the last 20 years. Back in 20 years? I lose track. 25 years. So in '92 we were in this situation. In 2007 we were in this situation. We're moving with the Yadkin Water Supply Project to make sure we don't get back in this situation and we keep that 10-year planning horizon going. Our other recommendation on this is that for capacity issues, remember I said earlier on the drought conditions, if we move from stage 1 to stage 2, we increase the restrictions, we also bump the rates. So in a stage 2 drought, the whole block rate structure goes up to another level. In stage 3, it all goes up another level. We're saying in this situation, we should not do that. These are shorter term duration issues. These are responses to short-term peaks in our capacity, and we're saying we should not increase the rates due to capacity changes. We should only be doing that due to drought. Same thing with system emergencies. We're saying in a system emergency, we're not going to bump it up. Did I say that correctly, or did I say that absolutely wrong? Absolutely wrong. Sorry. I got ahead of myself. No, during this condition, we would bump up the rates. During system emergencies, we would not, because this could last months. And part of our strategy and part of the philosophy on this is if we're in a restriction and we're telling people to use less water, we still have to pay the bills. So our rate structure is designed that if we go into these restrictions, that bump in rate is to keep us revenue neutral. So we don't lose money, we don't make any more money. And yes, our customers do point out to us, so you're telling me to conserve water, you're going to charge me more. And yes, we do, and most utilities do. So I misspoke. For capacity issues, yes, we would bump the rates up during this condition. During an emergency, we would not. One of the issues we kicked around a lot and spoke with most of you privately on some of these issues, get your feedback before coming here, is what do we do to get out of this capacity issue? And as we've gone through this, we said there's essentially 3 different kind of methodologies we can look at. We can look at a prescribed period of time and say after a certain amount of time we move out of that situation. We could wait to the next hot, dry season and see if we exceed it again. If we don't, say, okay, we're good, and then lift that restriction. or we could wait till new capacity was in place, which would be very stringent. After going through this and looking at the numbers and looking at the impacts, we think it's appropriate to use the first bullet. And we were leaning towards the middle bullet, and as we've gone back and really looked at this from a rate perspective and looked at this from a management perspective, how do we manage the process? Our concern was we didn't want to be bouncing in and out of these restrictions if capacity was bumping up. But we also looked at it from rates and how do we deal with it. So we've come back now and saying our recommendation is that it's essentially on stage 1, we would go for a 90-day period, and if during 90-day consecutive period we no longer violated that, we'd go back to normal. If we're in stage 2, we'd have to go 60 consecutive days of not violating stage 2, and then you would drop back to stage 1 or stage 0, depending on how far back you dropped. And stage 3, only 30 days. So we're talking about extreme conditions, and our history is these tend to be very momentary peaks. And we said we put the restrictions in place to bring it back down. If there's a drought at the same time that's driving this, we're already going to be in these restrictions. So if this is in response to drought that we're seeing the peaks, we've already put the restrictions in place. So this is normal weather years. We're bumping up against that peak. We're essentially trying to reduce that peak during that summer month. So putting these restrictions in place, putting them in quickly, but because it will be prescriptive, we think will bring us down. And we don't think it's appropriate then to keep those restrictions in place all through the next winter and into the next season, where it could be a wet season coming up, and meanwhile you're keeping that restriction. So we've gotten ourselves comfortable in the last week going through these numbers and analyzing a little bit more that we think going to a prescriptive time period rather than waiting to the whole next dry season will work for us. And again, we will not be bumping the rates up in these conditions because it is just for a short period of time.
We will be bumping rates up.
Always system emergencies.
Yep. I've done too many presentations this week, and they're all starting to run together. We could talk about sewer lines and people's backyards.
Good, Sal.
This week. I apologize for that. So to clarify, yes, we will be bumping rates up for that 60, 90-day period and then dropping it back down. That's why we wanted to keep that period shorter, so we didn't extend that rate increase through the wet weather months when people are conserving or aren't irrigating and we're charging the higher rate.
Ed, quick question. How do we notify the change in the level?
It's part of, the way we do it now, we'll do it through direct mailers as part of our bill. We'll do it through emails to those customers that have electronic bill payment with us. We can do a reverse 911. So if we got into an emergency situation, we would do a reverse 911 code red call out to our customers. We have the ability to do that. So we've got multiple avenues that we can use depending on the severity of the drought.
And I reckon my real concern would be especially if it was a kind of a short-term emergency, quick thing, where it was changing. Well, the emergency doesn't change the price, but one of those situations, I may not realize that we're under that situation until I get my first bill, and that's when it's already.
And that's why, depending on the severity, we'll literally go to a reverse 911 call and get the call out directly to our customers. In drought stage 1, we'll do it through public notification. We'll do County Connect. We'll use County View. Social media, and other social media, and our webpage. System emergencies. We talked briefly about that as an example. The existing ordinance is very limited in this regard. Basically says we could go to a stage 2 restriction, which is 2 days per week as a result of having to do maintenance on the system. And that's really all it says. We said that's not nearly adequate. We need to have a protocol in place that really allows us to take drastic actions in drastic situations. We are working right now with our partners in the Lancaster Water and Sewer District and the Catawba Water Management, Lancaster. I'm getting closer. I'm working.
It just makes me smile. I thought we was in Amish country.
They're a long distance partner.
Lancaster.
Lancaster. Yeah, Lancaster. Just like I said. Okay. We're working with our partners on the Catawba River Water Supply Project to develop a protocol for the plant operation. This is something that is being done system-wide in the Catawba River, saying what if the raw water intake on the reservoir and the lake is compromised in some way, shape, or form? What's the protocols that need to be put in place? So as a regional entity, each of the utilities working cooperatively to come up with a similar prescriptive measure, and we'll be incorporating that process by reference into this document also. The key here is the restrictions would be higher, but we will not initiate higher rates. In case I misspoke earlier. Primary change here on this process in an emergency compared to capacity or drought. In capacity or drought, the ordinance is prescriptive. You approve an ordinance and it says during this condition you will do this, during this condition you will do this. There's no latitude at the staff level in terms of, no, we don't want to do that, we want to do something else. In an emergency, the authority really goes to the Public Works Director and County Manager. The way we've drafted this, and we followed other ordinance around the state in this, is that the Public Works Director would determine that an emergency exists, would make a recommendation to the manager then saying, this is a severe or moderate emergency, and here's the recommendation as to which level of restriction we should go to. And by ordinance, the manager then would have the authority to implement that level of emergency. And the concern is that if it's truly an emergency, and we had a scare like this several months back. Board members may recall PCB contaminations that the City of Charlotte had in their wastewater system. And they dealt very effectively with that, and it's cost them millions of dollars to clean that up. But shortly after that, there was a scare that another community on the Catawba River had a contamination spill, and the concern was that contamination spill had gotten through their plant and could have gotten into the river. So there are real opportunities here for our water supply to be contaminated on a short-term basis. We were appropriately reacted to that. We stopped our intake off the river, worked off the reservoir, made sure there were no problems. There was no contamination, thankfully. It was a false alarm. But these conditions do exist and require us sometimes to move very quickly in response. So if it had gotten into our reservoir, if we had contamination and couldn't rely on that, we would have to go to some immediate water shortage responses. So we think that authority needs to be met. If a pipe broke, I mean, literally, we have a 42-inch pipe coming from the treatment plant and a 12-inch pipe. So we have some redundancy, but we could lose half of our water supply for short term. We need to be able to respond to that quickly, deal with that emergency, tell people, look, you need to conserve for the next few days. So that's the philosophy that runs through this. It's very permissive language and leaves a lot of latitude in terms of that determination. If we're in multiple conditions, if we're in a drought and an emergency takes place, or if we're in capacity limitation, emergency takes place, it's the more stringent of the two that would govern. And I think that just makes logical sense. Implementation of the program. Our goal is to keep the implementation as neutral as possible to our existing customers. Right now in our 2-day-a-week restriction, we have those 2 days per week spread out over these 10 geographic areas. So each geographic area has a different schedule that they're on. And the goal is to spread that demand over all 6 days and not have everybody irrigating on 2. Our plan is to use the same process. And these actually correspond to our building cycles in the system. The reason why each of these is a different size is because each one of them represents about the same amount of water. So where you have a much more dense population, where you have populations that's using irrigation, you have smaller geographic areas because Area 3 is using about as much water as Area 1 because we have a lot of population in Area 3 and very little population in Area 1. So they're based around that same level of water usage, and our goal is to keep that same process. So if we have a customer right now that's in Zone 3, and their irrigation days are Tuesdays and Thursdays, our goal, and we haven't worked out all the details yet, would be to keep them on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and maybe add Saturday. But keep their 2 days, add another day to it. We need to work through all the logistics to see if we can physically do that. But that's our goal, is to keep that, to try to not change people's irrigation mentality that they've grown to know and utilize. I mean, we look at, some communities do even odd addresses. If you're an odd address, number address, you do one schedule. If you're even number address, you do another schedule. That puts half your irrigation one day, half your irrigation on another cycle. We think in a large distributed system like we have, this is a better program than what some smaller municipalities do with even odd. And it keeps it consistent. So we're trying to show as little change to our customers as possible, other than we're adding another day to your watering schedule that you can use if you need to.
Hey, real quickly, number 11, is that based on industry?
That's wing it. Pilgrim's Pride.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is our largest consumer.
But they're not really bound by the restriction.
No, no.
This is more irrigation.
Yeah, these are billing cycles, and yeah, 11 isn't one of our,
Okay.
that's why when you said 11, no, there is no 11, there's only 10.
Okay, all right.
So yeah, that is Pilgrim's Pride in and of itself as a,
And wing it.
and Wingate. And Wingate, one of the things we'll do where, Wingate is right now just a wholesale water customer of ours, and one of the things that we're talking to Wingate about is that we need to enter into a formal water supply agreement with them, and one of the requirements is they would need to implement the same water restrictions that we have, and they would need to adopt that.
Question, please.
Yes.
You've got the Lancaster
Mhm.
and you got Anson. Can you have an emergency in Anson and only affect certain portions that, I mean, is it divided that way, or does it all feed into one system?
The systems are connected. Right now, we operate them as two separate, but they are all connected where we can flow water from one end to the other. So if we have an emergency on one side, we can bring water from the other to the extent it's available. That has happened way too often on the Anson side, where Anson has had challenges. Received a phone call this morning. We're in that situation right now with Anson, where they had a problem at the plant and asked us to come off the system. So we open those valves and feed the whole system then through the Catawba plant. Again, the water response plan has the stage 0 normal condition response, where the existing ordinance really doesn't address what happens during normal conditions. So in normal conditions, again, we're recommending that mandatory 3 day per week. That 3 day per week is enforceable under this ordinance, so even during normal situations, there is an enforcement procedure. We'll talk about enforcement next. And there are voluntary indoor restrictions that are always in place, and that's just part of good practice and good efficient use of water. I'm not going to run the board through all these little details of turn off faucets while shaving and rinsing, and that are in our existing ordinance and that we're proposing. These are mostly public education kind of issues where we put this out as a public notification. Some of these do become restrictions where it's outdoor water use, getting more progressive. You can't wash your car at certain levels. You can't wash off your driveway. Can't fill a new swimming pool. You can keep your old one topped off. As you get really stringent, you can't even fill a new pool. And when you get into that stage 3 and stage 4. We have these as part of the handout for the board. This presentation we'll be putting on our website after this meeting, so it'll be there. But there's a lot of that kind of detail to go through that talk about how the ordinance works now. Our intent was to make very little changes other than to really clarify, but there were a few changes that came into place. We're now going to prohibit water transport outside of Union County. Well, this is all
That's existing.
This is all existing in current and proposed. So if the board likes, I could walk through all this. Actually, I'll have Amy walk through all this, but it's in your packet. It'll be on the website. It's really not significant change over what we're doing now. The other thing we talked about, want to talk about is industrial commercial water restrictions. And our suggestion is that we follow the Low Inflow Protocol. We kicked around the concept, is that stringent enough or not stringent? We really have one major industry that is our water customer, and that is Pilgrim's Pride. They're our single largest customer. What the water industry recognizes is that commercial industrial operations, particularly industrial operations, manufacturing operations, have built-in efficiencies on water use because they're paying for that water. We charge, Pilgrim's Pride is a commercial customer and gets charged the same commercial rates as all of our other commercial customers. So there's a built-in incentive on their side to be very efficient in their use of water because it goes right to their bottom line. It's an overhead number for them, part of their cost of doing business, and they want to be as efficient as they can. As we start getting into stage 3, where drought gets really sufficient, that's where we go beyond that and say, okay, we now need to sit down with that industry and go, what can you do to modify your process to further reduce water? Can you do things on night shift? Can you do things here? How do you balance your demand against our demand, and how do we work more cooperatively? And we need to do that in stage 3 and 4. We don't think it's appropriate, though, for us to ever get to a point where we're shutting down a major industry and saying, you can't use water. The board always has that authority, I think, and I'll play attorney for a second, on the police powers of the county itself to be able to enforce drastic actions if they needed to. We didn't think we needed to take it to be that prescriptive in this ordinance for that extreme of a situation. So if we get that extreme, I think that's a one-off kind of condition. It's not that we have 10 different industries or 20 different industries. That's not our customer base. So we can work that one-on-one with that industry if we got to that point. The enforcement process. The procedures are essentially the same as the existing ordinance. So we're not changing any of our enforcement mechanisms, but we are changing recommending changes to the civil penalties. The existing ordinance just has one set of civil penalties and says, regardless of what stage of drought we're in, if you violate the ordinance, first time it's warning, second violation, $100 fine, third $500, fourth $500, fifth $1,000. We're proposing that we ratchet that up and say, at normal condition, we're actually dropping it a little bit. We're saying we can go through 2 levels of warning if we're not in a drought, because we really want to be educated. So if we're not in a drought, people are watering 4 or 5 days instead of their 3 days. We want to get out and educate them why they shouldn't be doing that, make sure they don't. They screw up again, okay, we'll give you one more warning. After that, okay, then we start hitting you with fines. But if we're in a drought, stage 1, first violation, we almost always do a warning, just because sometimes people don't know. They're out of town, the irrigation system is set on a timer, they left, someone said it wrong. So the first time is always a warning, but second time, that initial violation now goes up from $100 up to $500, depending on the stage of drought we're in. Third violation goes from $250 up to $1,000. Fourth, from $500 up to $1,000. And fifth, from $1,000 up to $2,000, and we shut your water off. So if you get in a stage 2 drought or more, and you're in your 5th violation, you're ignoring us and just saying, I'll pay the fine. No, we're going to come in and shut your water off and disconnect you from the system. And that's not in our existing ordinance, the shut-off provision.
Mm-hmm.
It is. We don't have the asterisk there for it.
On the zeros.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that is in our existing ordinance. We got up to $1,000 in fines to some customers back in 2007, so we had people hitting that 5th level. I don't know if we ever shut anybody off. So yeah, it does happen. You have people that make significant investments in their landscaping and are going, I'll pay the fine. I'm going to keep my grass green. And at a certain level going, yeah, we need to shut you off. The money is there to be a deterrent. It's not that we want $1,000 penalty from you. We're telling you this is serious, stop doing this. And if we get customers that refuse to stop, yes, we will come in and shut them off.
The one question I would ask the board is during our individual briefings, there was some expression that maybe this was not punitive enough, so.
We actually bumped it up from the earlier draft, so this is bumped up from some of the earlier drafts that we did share.
Yeah, two thoughts as I sit here. When you showed the picture a few moments ago of the Catawba River, I honestly had forgotten how bad it was. I mean, we can remember it,
Mhm.
but I do remember pontoon boats and all sitting on dirt, and it was dry dirt. I would say, and I remember how serious it was and how concerned I was as just a member of the community. If we were in stage 3, I personally think there's no exception for any oversight of waste. If you go out of town, you leave irrigation going, shame on you. And maybe we do implement a fine there, but as far as the punitive aspect, I'll defer to the consensus of the board. But I'd like to see at least $100 fine for stage 3, just to say, we're in a critical situation. We need you to pay attention. There is no room for you just to go out of town and hope you don't get caught.
Mhm.
That was some serious.
Yeah, it's a serious drought at that point.
But you wouldn't go, I mean, you almost have to be progressive going to the various levels. I mean, you're not gonna go from stage 0 to stage 4 just like, unless it's an emergency.
Right. Under emergency, under a drought, you could skip a stage in drought. You know, drought could come on very severe, and you could go from a 1 to a 3. So that is a possibility. You could jump that quickly. But you would probably always go to a 1 first. But you could skip that stage from 2 to 3 potentially.
Well, along with what the Commissioner just said, I think, stage 4, $200, that's not even a slap on the wrist. If it's that bad, that maybe that should be a little more aggressive.
I think with that stage 3, I'll be 100, 500, 750, 1,000, 1,500 in stage 3. And putting your $100 on the warning,
Sure.
and then 500 on second,
Sure.
750 on third, 1,000 on fourth, 15. Because I mean, by the 4th violation, it's complete. We're not listening, it doesn't matter.
What's the process to educate people before we go assessing fines?
Well, I mean, that's the warning. Well, two things. One, as we go into the stages of drought, we will be putting out public information notifications to all of our customers in their bills, depending on how severe, again, reverse 911. So we're contacting our customers saying, we're now in this level of condition, here's your new schedule, here's what you have to do, here's what's voluntary, here's what's mandatory. So that gets out to them. Does everyone get it? Yeah, we hope so, that they open their mail and read it, and they listen to the phone messages and don't just go, yeah, was Union County bothering them before? So we'll do multiple levels of outreach, but that's why in the lower stage we said, okay, if you violate, we do a warning, and we literally go out and we'll do a door hanger on your property in addition to the other notification we've done, said, you're in violation, you need to stop doing this.
Is that a media blitz as well?
Yeah, yes, that would be media also.
And in that, I know this maybe sounds elementary, but in that, are we also reminding people that their irrigation is, if it's on schedule, because you don't think about it.
Yes.
It's just on a schedule, just.
Yeah, go change your timer.
Or change your time.
Mm-hmm. Because you're absolutely right. Most people set it, forget it.
Think about it.
You don't want to mess with it, really. Screw it.
It's a pain in the rear end if you mess it up.
I wouldn't,
Well.
hadn't been blessed like this.
Whatever.
So we will take that suggestion because I see a lot of head nodding and we'll update that accordingly. There is an appeal and a variance process in this, so if you're hit with a penalty, if we shut you off, there is an appeal process. In the existing ordinance, we intend to just keep that same appeal process going forward. And I imagine the main reason for an appeal process is that we want a structured process so everyone doesn't run to your desk and say, fix this for me. So there is a structured appeal process that they've got to run through administrative process before just running to our county commissioners and saying, why'd your staff fine me $100?
Does your system identify customers like myself? I've got my irrigation on a well, and then I've got the county water. Does your system identify those customers?
No, we wouldn't know if you have, our database does not show if you're on a private well.
And in a water restriction, we don't really care if you're on a well
Yeah.
or if you're on through a public water supply.
Well, that's a good point, because, there are times when we're on a restriction for one case or the other,
Mhm.
that the well is, mine's like 350 foot deep, and it's generally strong, so,
Mhm.
and I got called one time that I forgot to turn mine off,
Mhm.
but it was my irrigation. So,
Yeah,
we need to communicate that to the people, that it does apply if the restriction is you don't water with your well or your, because I don't think people understand that.
Now, the,
Correctly, if
In,
that-
in the past,
Yeah.
we had people put signs up that says irrigation done by well,
Mhm.
just so you're not given a violation notice.
But you're saying that it applies,
No, we can't fine you for how you use your well.
Okay.
The state law won't allow us to do that. Your private well is we can't control groundwater. North Carolina. Now in Florida, yeah, we could do that because it was all waters of the state, including groundwater, was owned by the state, and so they passed that authority in local government. And your groundwater was your drinking water supply in Florida. And many parts of the country, if you're groundwater dependent, whether you have a private well or a public system, you're pulling off the same body of groundwater. But here we're very different. Our surface water is, our water's coming from surface water from the Catawba. And by statute, I believe, there is no control on groundwater usage in this state.
We could do that through public education.
well, I think we need to address it, though, so.
Which is why we had some 300 customers in that zone 3 go to private irrigation wells after the drought. One, they did the economics and said, we're spending a lot of money on water to water these 1 acre properties, and it takes them out of the restrictions.
It takes 8 hours to run one cycle through my system.
Yeah, the groundwater is not the most productive here. This is fractured rock, and it's hit or miss whether or not you're going to find water and where you're going to find it, and it can sometimes be very unproductive.
What was that, Greg? 30 minutes per zone, at 18 zone. Excellent.
So to just summarize where we are, we're formalizing our long-term demand management strategy by incorporating a maximum 3 days per week irrigation schedule as part of our normal stage 0 conditions. We're creating a comprehensive plan to respond to the various stages, the various types of water shortage conditions with a set of responses to those. This ordinance will be compliant with state regulations. The state has reviewed our plan that's existing right now and has commented that some of it is too permissive and needs to be more restrictive and more prescriptive. So this will get us into compliance with state regulations and the Low Inflow Protocol. And one of the things we're recognizing is that we need to beef up our public education on irrigation schedules, water restrictions, efficient use of water. We are not doing a lot in public information education now, and we need to ratchet that level up as we move forward. And that's it. Next steps. That's it.
What he said. That's all, folks. All right, any questions?
It's a nice job.
Thank you. Again, we'll be bringing this back as a draft ordinance probably in the next, probably 2 months from now. We have drafted language. We'll obviously have to run through our attorneys and get them to clean it, scrub it up, and get it in good ordinance language. And then there'll be a required public hearing, since this is an ordinance, and then bring to the board for adoption.
Thank you much.
Okay.
Nothing further?
We have that one other item.
Oh, go ahead.
As the board is aware, probably for about a year or so now, we have been trying to identify properties for our human services building. We started out with, I think, originally 11 sites that were identified by our consultants. They have gone through a process of eliminating some of those sites based upon constraints, et cetera. We're down to 2 sites, one that is within the city of Monroe, one that is in unincorporated county. Ed and Richard went to the planning committee at the City of Monroe yesterday and pretty much indicated to them that we have 2 sites that we prefer to stay in Monroe, but if they don't want us, then we are more than willing to go elsewhere. I think that was very well received by the planning committee. We also indicated, and this is very similar to the process we used at Weddington, also indicated that we would like a liaison to work with on their commission, our council, as we go through this process. They were very receptive, definitely wanted it to stay within the limits of Monroe. We're excited about the potential site. There's still a whole lot to be done with respect to the site. But at this point in time, in discussions with the mayor, he indicated that if we got a letter and resolution to him today, that he would get it on their September 2nd meeting, which is next Tuesday when we meet as well, supporting, that his recommendation would be that they support a site within the City of Monroe and in essence would work with us. And they do have an expedited process, we found out, that we are going to be talking to them about as to trying to use that for this particular site so that we can get our employees out of the facility they're in now.
And Cindy, just as clarification, the site that's within the city is the one that we've discussed, that we've talked about?
Yes, yes.
It's not a new site that's been identified?
No, no. So the request that I have of the board is for you all to give authorization to the chairman to sign this letter so that it can be sent to the mayor with Monroe so that it can be placed on their agenda.
I make a motion, we give the chairman that authority.
All in favor? Opposed? None?
Well, I'll say that I was approached by some of those planning members last night, and they were very positive.
Good.
So that was encouraging.
We felt, actually we met 8 o'clock yesterday morning before our strategic planning initiative at 8:30, and both Ed and Richard came back feeling very positive about the message they had received. So,
Good.
and that is all.
All right, move to adjourn. Thank you.